back, everybody. I'm your host, Doug Miller, and this is the Discipline of Greatness. This is a podcast about what separates the great from the rest. Not talent, not luck, but discipline. The habits built in silence. The work done when no one is watching. The choices made long before the spotlight ever shows up. Here we explore the stories of legendary athletes, iconic teams, and defining moments. Not just for what they achieved, but how they achieved it. Because greatness isn't built in moments, it's built in habits. This is episode 4. We will be covering a great Canadian athlete, mixed martial artist, UFC legend, Georges St-Pierre. Greatness rarely announces itself early. It doesn't arrive with confidence. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It often arrives quietly, disguised as discomfort. Georges St-Pierre did not grow up believing he was destined to be a champion. He did not walk through life feeling powerful, dominant, or fearless. In many ways, he felt the opposite. What made Georges St-Pierre extraordinary was not an absence of fear. It was his refusal to let fear remain unmanaged. This episode is not a story of a man who loved violence. It is a story of a man who learned very early in life that discipline could become a form of protection, a way to build certainty in a world that felt unpredictable. Before the titles, before the octagon, before the legacy, there was structure, there was routine, and there was discipline. Georges St-Pierre was born on May 19, 1981, in Saint Isidore, Quebec, a small working-class town where people were defined less by ambition and more by responsibility. Life there did not revolve around dreams of greatness. It revolved around showing up, doing your job, and providing for your family. His father, Roland St-Pierre, worked in construction. George watched him leave early, return late, exhausted but uncomplaining. From his father, George learned that effort was not something you celebrated, it was something you owed. His mother, Pauline St-Pierre, worked as a nurse's aide. She brought structure, compassion, and discipline into the home. The household ran on routine, and expectations were clear. George grew up the middle child with 2 sisters, one older and one younger. The family lived modestly. There were no luxuries. There were no shortcuts. What they had was routine and accountability. As a child, George was quiet. He was polite. He was introspective. He did not seek confrontation, and he avoided drawing attention to himself whenever possible. Unfortunately, that temperament made him vulnerable. At school, George became a target for bullying. Other children pushed him, mocked him, and stole his lunch money. What stayed with George was not anger. It was fear. Fear of being unable to defend himself, fear of being powerless, fear of not being able to control his environment. Years later, George would speak openly about this period of his life. He admitted that he did not want to fight anyone. He did not dream of hurting people. He simply wanted the fear to stop. Recognizing this, his father made a decision that would alter the trajectory of George's life. At the age of 7, George was enrolled in Kyokushin Karate. That decision was not about creating a fighter. It was about creating structure. Kyokushin Karate introduced George to discipline. I'm sure I'm butchering that, and I apologize. It introduced George to discipline in its purest form. Classes were strict. Movements were repeated endlessly. There was no room for improvisation or ego. Every session began with bows. Every instruction was followed without argument. Silence was expected, focus was demanded, and repetition was non-negotiable. At first, George struggled. He was not the strongest. He was not the most aggressive. But he noticed something important. The students who improved were not always the most talented. They were the most consistent. They showed up every time. They followed the rules. They trusted the process. Slowly, George began to understand that discipline worked even when confidence didn't. On days when he felt afraid, he still trained. On days when he felt tired, he still trained. The routine itself became a source of stability. Karate did not eliminate fear from George's life, it gave him a way to manage it. Over time, his confidence grew, not because he felt invincible, but because he felt prepared. The discipline he learned on the mat began to bleed into every area of his life. Schoolwork, responsibilities, self-control. This was the beginning of what would become a lifelong pattern. When emotion was unreliable, George leaned on discipline. As George entered his teenage years, the foundation karate had given him began to reveal its limitations. While it had taught him structure, respect, and self-control, he understood that real combat was more complex. It involved wrestling, boxing, and submission grappling. It involved unpredictability. It involved chaos. Then, George discovered, as many young teenagers did around his age, early UFC events on good old VHS. What captured his attention was not the violence. It was the efficiency. Smaller fighters defeating larger opponents through leverage, timing, and preparation. Specialists neutralizing aggression with technique. Order being imposed on chaos. For the first time, George saw fighting not as something emotional, but as something technical, something learnable, something that could be broken down and understood. He realized something that would shape the rest of his life. Fighting was not about rage. It was about readiness. There was one major obstacle standing in his way. George had no money. So he adapted. He practiced wrestling by grappling with his friends in schoolyards. He studied boxing footwork by watching VHS tapes frame by frame, pausing and replaying movements until they made sense. He shadowboxed alone in front of mirrors for hours, rehearsing combinations and defensive movements until they became automatic. There was no coach correcting him, no crowd watching him, no validation coming his way, pats on the back, whatever. It wasn't there. It was just him putting in the work. Repetition after repetition. George trained this way not because it was inspiring, but because it was necessary. He was not chasing attention, he was chasing understanding. He wanted to know how every movement worked, why it worked, and when it should be used. This period quietly shaped him into a student of the sport. He wasn't just learning how to fight, he was learning how to prepare. Before entering professional MMA, George competed wherever he could find opportunity. Amateur mixed martial arts bouts, karate tournaments, grappling competitions across Quebec. These events were small, the venues were modest, the crowds were minimal. But to George, they were invaluable. He didn't dominate immediately. He didn't overwhelm opponents with talent. Instead, he learned. He treated every competition as information. He paid attention to how his body reacted under pressure, how his breathing changed when adrenaline spiked, how his decision-making slowed when fatigue set in, how fear resurfaced when situations became unfamiliar. George noticed that competition exposed truths training could hide. Mistakes became obvious. Weaknesses revealed themselves. Patterns emerged. While many competitors chased the excitement of winning, George chased understanding. Every match, win or lose, became a lesson. Every mistake became immediate feedback. He began to separate emotion from performance. Losing did not devastate him. Winning did not inflate him. Both outcomes were simply data points. This mindset set him apart long before championships ever entered the picture. As George committed fully to pursuing mixed martial arts, financial reality became unavoidable. Training was expensive. Coaching required money. Facilities required fees. George supported himself by working as a bouncer. The job was demanding and often exhausting. Long nights, physical strain, little rest. Just trying to picture Georges St-Pierre outside of a little bar in downtown Quebec. Tight t-shirt. Just throwing dudes around when they're getting out of hand. Kind of paints a funny picture. When his shifts ended, his training began. He slept on gym mats when necessary. He trained through soreness and fatigue. He structured his entire life around preparation. There was no balance. There was no backup plan. His days followed a relentless rhythm. Wrestling sessions in the morning, conditioning work during the day, striking practice at night, film study and visualization before sleep. He did not train to feel confident. He trained to remove uncertainty. Every repetition served a purpose. Every exhausting session answered a question. Could he maintain discipline when tired? Could he think clearly under stress? Could he show up consistently without motivation? Fear was still present during this time. Doubt surfaced often, but fear no longer dictated his actions. The hunger years were invisible to most people, but they built the foundation that would support everything that came next. In 2002, George turned professional, stepping into a world that looked nothing like the bright lights of the UFC. The Canadian mixed martial arts scene was still developing, and opportunities came in smaller venues against tougher and often more experienced fighters. From the beginning, George did not approach professional fighting as an emotional proving ground. He approached it as an extension of his preparation. Every fight was a test of whether his discipline could hold under higher stakes. During this time, he competed in promotions such as Universal Combat Challenge, where the environment demanded composure. There was little margin for error. Fighters were hungry, aggressive, and often fighting for survival rather than recognition. George's style stood out immediately. He did not rush exchanges. He did not chase knockouts. He did not fight to impress. Instead, he imposed structure. He used a disciplined jab to control distance and disrupt rhythm. He relied on well-timed takedowns to dictate where the fight would take place. Once the fight hit the mat, he applied steady pressure, advancing position carefully, never forcing transitions that carried unnecessary risk. Opponents often felt suffocated, not overwhelmed. There was a calmness to George's approach that was unusual for a young professional fighter. When moments became chaotic, he did not accelerate. He slowed things down. When opponents grew reckless, he became more precise. This discipline paid off. George captured the UCC welterweight championship not by outmuscling opponents, but by outthinking them. The title represented more than a belt. It was validation that his system worked against experienced professionals. More importantly, it confirmed something George already believed. Preparation translated. By the time the UFC took notice, Georges St-Pierre was not chasing opportunity. He was ready for it. When Georges St-Pierre entered the UFC in 2004, he did not arrive as a finished product. What he arrived with was something far more dangerous than hype or bravado. He arrived with a system. From the very beginning, George treated the UFC not as a proving ground for ego, but as a laboratory for preparation. Every opponent represented a unique problem, and George believed that every problem could be solved through discipline. While other fighters trained generally, getting in shape, sparring hard, relying on instinct, George trained specifically. He did not ask, "How do I win?" He asked, "What exactly does this opponent do best, and how do I remove it?" Fight camps for George were built backward. He started with the opponent, not himself. He studied hours of footage, not casually, not emotionally, but analytically. He looked for patterns, how an opponent reacted under pressure, how they moved when tired, how they defended takedowns late in rounds, how they behaved when momentum shifted. He paid attention to details most fighters ignored: foot placement, breathing patterns, reactions after missed strikes. The guy was just an assassin. George once explained that fighting was not chaos to him. It was information, and information could be controlled. In training camp, nothing was accidental. Sparring partners were chosen to mimic his opponent's exact style: height, reach, and rhythm. If he was fighting a striker, he brought in multiple strikers with different tempos. If he was fighting a wrestler, he trained with wrestlers who could punish mistakes. He didn't want comfort. He wanted exposure. George believed that fear came from uncertainty, and uncertainty came from lack of preparation. So he engineered his camps to eliminate surprises. He wanted to experience every possible bad scenario before fight night. Being taken down, being clipped, being exhausted, being behind on the scorecards. Because if it happened in training, it wouldn't shock him in the cage. This mindset was evident early in his UFC run. In his debut, George didn't rush. Which, I mean, it's funny that that's his nickname, Rush St-Pierre, but he didn't chase finishes. He imposed structure. He controlled distance. He mixed striking with takedowns, constantly forcing his opponent to think instead of react. It wasn't flashy, but it was suffocating. As he moved up the ranks, this approach became more refined. Before facing elite wrestlers, George dedicated entire camps to wrestling defense and offensive takedown timing. He drilled entries thousands of times, not just to complete takedowns, but to do so safely, minimizing risk. His goal was not domination, it was certainty. Before facing dangerous strikers, George focused obsessively on range management and defensive responsibility. He trained his jab not as a weapon, but as a tool for control. He practiced stepping just outside striking range, forcing opponents to miss by inches, then immediately changing levels for takedowns. Every movement had a purpose. Even his conditioning was opponent-specific. George didn't train cardio to survive fights. He trained cardio to maintain discipline when others lost it. He wanted to be the same fighter in round 5 as he was in round 1, while his opponent slowly unraveled. George also understood that discipline extended beyond physical training. His mental preparation was just as structured. He visualized entire fights repeatedly. Walkouts, introductions, early exchanges, mistakes, corrections, and adjustments. He rehearsed success and adversity equally. He did not visualize knockouts. He visualized composure. This is why George rarely looked emotional in the cage. He had already been there mentally. Nothing felt new, nothing felt chaotic. By the time he reached title contention, George was not just fighting opponents, he was out preparing them. When George eventually captured the UFC welterweight title by defeating Matt Hughes, it wasn't because he was stronger or angrier. It was because he had prepared for Hughes' tendencies with surgical precision. In that fight, that victory wasn't an upset. It was an absolute execution. When Georges St-Pierre stepped into the octagon against Matt Serra in 2007, the outcome shocked the sport. George was the reigning champion. Serra was the underdog. On paper, the result felt inevitable. And then it wasn't. The knockout loss was sudden, violent, and public. In a sport that rarely offers grace, the reaction was immediate. Praise evaporated, doubt rushed in, questions about George's mentality, toughness, and heart spread just as quickly as his highlights once had. For many fighters, that moment becomes a fracture that never fully heals. For George, it became a mirror. He did not argue with the criticism. He didn't blame circumstances. He didn't attempt to explain the loss away. Instead, he withdrew from the spotlight entirely. He went quiet. And in that quiet, he confronted the most uncomfortable truth of his career. Fear had crept into his decision-making. Not fear of fighting, but fear of losing what he had built. George later admitted that being champion had introduced a new kind of pressure. Expectations, responsibility, the weight of maintaining perfection. That pressure subtly changed how he approached competition. It made him hesitate where he once trusted preparation. So, he rebuilt everything, not just physically, psychologically. George immersed himself in sports psychology. He studied the nature of fear, stress, and performance under pressure. He learned that fear itself was not the enemy. Surprise was. Uncertainty was. He began to restructure his camps to include mental adversity. He visualized being hurt, being tired, being behind. He rehearsed responding calmly to chaos rather than reacting emotionally. The rematch with Sarah was not fueled by anger. It was fueled by correction. When they met again, George imposed control from the opening exchange. There was no rush, no desperation, no chaos. Only, you guessed it, discipline. The fight was not competitive. That night did more than reclaim a championship. It reshaped Georges St-Pierre permanently. From that moment forward, fear would never again operate unchecked in his preparation. By the time Georges St-Pierre established himself as a UFC champion, it became clear that he was not training the way other fighters trained. While many athletes relied on intensity, toughness, and repetition of familiar routines, George treated training as a constantly evolving system that required redesign before every fight. He did not believe in training hard for the sake of training hard. He believed in training correctly. George approached preparation the way an engineer approaches a machine. Every part of his body had a function. Every movement had a purpose. If something was inefficient, it was removed. Gone. Get out of here. If something was vulnerable, it was reinforced. One of the most misunderstood aspects of George's discipline was his obsession with eliminating weaknesses rather than maximizing strengths. Early in his career, he recognized that being well-rounded was not enough. To dominate at the highest level, he needed to be adaptable under pressure, capable of switching strategies instantly without emotional interference. That belief fundamentally shaped how he trained. George made the deliberate decision to seek discomfort. He regularly trained outside his comfort zone, often putting himself in positions where he was not the best athlete in the room. He trained with Olympic-level wrestlers who could overpower him in pure grappling exchanges. He trained with elite strikers who could expose defensive gaps. He trained with specialists whose only job was to punish his mistakes. He did this because George believed confidence built on dominance was fragile. Confidence built on preparation, however, was durable. Wrestling became a cornerstone of his system. Despite starting wrestling later than many of his opponents, George became one of the most effective takedown artists in mixed martial arts history. This did not come from natural instinct. It came from obsessive drilling. He trained entries repeatedly until they became automatic. He focused on timing rather than force, learning to shoot when opponents were slightly off balance, when their weight shifted, when their focus drifted. To George, wrestling was not about control on the ground, it was about control everywhere. George recognized that balance, coordination, and spatial awareness were limiting factors in many fighters' careers. To address this, he incorporated gymnastics into his training. He trained on rings, practiced handstands, and worked through complex bodyweight movements that demanded precision and control. Conditioning was treated with the same precision. George did not train cardio simply to endure fights. He trained to maintain decision-making under fatigue. Strength training prioritized functionality, explosive power, and injury prevention. Recovery was sacred. Sleep, nutrition, and rest were non-negotiable. Mental training separated him most. He visualized adversity constantly. Fear was not avoided, it was rehearsed. By fight night, nothing felt new. George did not train to win fights. He trained to remove variables. What followed was one of the most methodical championship reigns in combat sports history. George did not defend his title by overwhelming opponents with raw aggression. He dismantled them through preparation. Against B.J. Penn, George imposed pace and conditioning. Against John Fitch, he dictated distance and tempo. When he faced Josh Koscheck, he weaponized the jab as control. Against Dan Hardy, he chose restraint over spectacle. Jake Shields, he neutralized danger with composure. Carlos Condit, he adapted under adversity. Nick Diaz, he dismantled chaos with structure. Against Johnny Hendricks, he relied on experience and resilience. Each defense followed the same pattern: control, pressure, and precision. At the height of his dominance, Georges St-Pierre walked away. Still champion, still absolutely elite, but discipline demanded honesty. And honesty told him it was time. Years later, George returned, not chasing nostalgia but curiosity. He moved up in weight, he adapted his preparation, he tested mastery. He won the middleweight title, then he walked away again on his own terms. One fight, just to see if he still had it. Georges St-Pierre did not chase fame, he chased readiness. He proved fear is not weakness, preparation creates freedom, and discipline outlasts talent. Greatness rarely announces itself. It shows up early, it prepares longer, it repeats the basics when others look for shortcuts. Georges St-Pierre did not become great because he loved fighting. He became great because he respected discipline. Remember, greatness is not built in moments. It is built in habits when no one is watching, when quitting would be easier, when excuses are available, but discipline is chosen. That is the discipline of greatness. Thank you for listening, everybody. Before you go, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you're locked in for future episodes. They come every Thursday. You can follow us on Instagram, Discipline of Greatness on Instagram there, where we will be getting updates and behind-the-scenes content. And, just want to say thank you for your support. Keeps this show growing, and appreciate every single one of you. Have a great day.